With the second test close at hand and still not knowing which wine is connected to the painting, in the sixth episode of the hit series Drops of God, Camille and Lorenzo take a trip to Italy to search for clues on the next mystery wine. In the small town of Besenello, where Alexandre is feared more than revered, Camille tries to figure out which wine it could be and how it connects to her father. Luckily, you don't have to travel across the world to enjoy our channel. All you have to do is hit that like and subscribe button, turn on that bell for notifications. Warning, full spoilers ahead. And with that, let's talk about Alexandre Leisure and the consequences of his actions.
Yeah, it was interesting. I feel like we learned a lot about him, even though he wasn't central in this. We could kind of see, as she's going through this small town and she's meeting with these winemakers, we can see the fear that they have of, not wanting to be excluded from the guide, and
Right.
the trepidation of like, how are they going to be rated on this? What's going to be the description? So we really kind of see the effect of that in the way that she meets with all of those kind of winemakers.
Yeah, and we see that after when she like threatens the winemakers, when we first meet the winemakers, we see a rinky-dink operation. It's just this dad, and he does it with his wife and son, and he's like, no, like we don't have time to do tastings, like we're in like the middle of a harvest, like no time at all. And until she uses the Alexandre Leisure guide, then all the doors start opening up, and like, because people are afraid, because we found out that he was with his guide either excluding them or how he rated them. He put small wineries out of business there,
And put people into depression that they weren't able to crawl their way out of. It really, he had a lot of power, and she
oh
kind
yeah,
of finally gets to see that. And I wonder whether or not he felt the weight of those decisions when he was making them, because at one point the owner of the hotel was kind of angry at him, but then towards the end she kind of walked it back, and she did say that he he did understand what these people were doing, and he did respect their work.
right.
So I think it did come from a place of love, even if it did have these kind of like echoing consequences based off of every decision he made.
Right. To me, it felt like he almost became what he hated. Like he stood up to this elite wine group as like they were, how do they know everything about wine? It's just a label. And then he basically became this, like, all the wineries were basically him trying to like get into this elite wine group, and he became what he hated. And I I feel like this episode told a story about what Alexandre Leisure wanted, in a way, right? Like, I think that it was showing that, like, the reason he chose this wine, like, he saw through the hotel owner and her father who was making wine with her. He saw what his life could have been with Camille. Like, if he had kept that life and didn't have Camille ripped away from him, that he could have had that. He could have had a vineyard that he was, creating himself. He could have made the wine with four hands and like really put the time and effort and care into it. And I feel like this wine showed what he wanted his life to be, but he ended up becoming the thing he hated.
It's interesting when you put it that way, because then that's also similar to the painting and how that was, the product of kind of two people. I don't know how true that was, kind of based off my research. I think they might have kind of like tweaked that. I did see that her dad was the one that got her into Milan to study art, I think with other people that I think helped kind of shape some of what she did. I think that's a really sad idea as far as, what the two of them could have been together, and how he could have been as a dad. And we did see, that we did see this amazing relationship he had with his daughter when he was with her. It still was very one-sided, kind of like his relationship with Issei, where it was definitely oriented around wine and uber focused, and that
Right.
he could be pretty brutal when she was incorrect.
Right, because I think he called her a loser at one point. He's like, "Losers get it wrong" or something, or only winners know the real thing, something like that along those lines. Where yeah, he was
Right.
pretty like slamming the table when she's like, "Oh, can I try it again?" Yeah, he is not winning Father of the Year awards from what we saw. There could be another episode in the past that shows that he was, a very caring, passionate father, because he does, the things that he is passionate about, he does put a lot of time and effort into.
I think that once again, even though we really don't see him in that, we see the effects of him in this, more than we necessarily see him. And yet, I think that we've learned a lot about him in this episode, and it, to me, makes him even more complex. Doesn't necessarily make him a better or a worse person, just more complex and more interesting. I can see why he made some of the choices he did and why he's the kind of person that he is. He's driven by this one thing, and it's really interesting how much you can kind of see from him in this.
What's really cool is we see, when Camille used the leisure guide to get in, and she even knew it was wrong. Like she had talked to the innkeep, and she was like, people are tough here, but if you're persistent, they'll find it endearing. They'll let you in eventually. And so she'd use that guidebook to get her foot in the door, and I could feel that Camille felt ashamed that she found out, and it ultimately led to her not wanting to continue writing the guide.
I think that she finally kind of walked in her dad's shoes for a period of time and really got perspective on that from her. And I think it was a good chance for her to meet him and for her to see the consequences of his actions, and then for her to also choose that this wasn't necessarily right for her.
Right. Do you think that Luca is going to sabotage her test, the third one?
Absolutely. I don't know how, and like, does he have inside information on the test? What kind of test even is it? Because that's
Right.
another huge question. I really thought these were going to be pretty straightforward wine tests. I did call one thing, which was that because they wanted like the actual winery, like the actual like wine,
Mm-hmm.
that there may be a connection with like a specific place or like people at that place. And I think that ended up being very true with this. But I still thought there were going to be tastings. And this was completely different. And who knows what they'll even do with the next one? Like, could it be like food and wine, or like, I don't even know.
I know you say that you thought they were all going to be tastings, but I would say that you were correct in thinking that I think it's always going to be a wine. Like they have to deduce what the wine is. So as I was watching this episode, it made me feel like you were correct in the sense of they are identifying three wines, but it's just not on taste.
And that's a very weird way to have to do that, like
Oh
identify this
yeah.
wine from this painting.
Right. And they were in the completely wrong wheelhouse. They were looking at peach, jasmine, quince, and it was a red wine. they were searching for a
Right.
white wine, and it was a red wine that had none of those flavors, that was just connected to this woman that lives in the town where a father-daughter painted something, father-daughter grew wine, and he is missing the father-daughter relationship that he had with Camille. So sad.
So this felt like it was very much towards her, which means is the next test geared very much towards him. Whereas so the first one, if they both have good wine training, is something that they should have the same like equal footing on. It's a blind test. It's a very famous wine, so they should kind of have equal footing. Hopefully, be able to get kind of a tie on it. This one seemed like it was very much whether or not it was for her. It definitely seemed like it was about her.
Right.
Maybe Issei could have figured that out if he'd gone there as well. So maybe it wasn't necessarily like for her, but definitely about her. I'm wondering if this next one is going to be about him and his relationship with Alexander.
I I don't know if it is. I do think it could have a potential. Who knows? Maybe that first one was special with Issei, and that was how he was able to get it so easily. He was like, "Oh, this is the first wine Issei and I drank together," or yeah, it could be that because I did think about that, but I do think that it it has seemed that these tests have been a lot easier for Issei. And this test would have been a lot harder if he didn't have the random happenstance of having some of his paperwork from Alexander Leisure. But,
Right.
the first wine tasting was easy. He wasn't even trying to figure out the second wine. Like, he was more dealing with his confirmed birth, essentially, of, like, who his father is and dealing with his mom.
He didn't even know if he wanted to continue the test. He didn't know he lost his sense of self, which was something that was very easy to him. I think a lot of people, if you ask them, what do you want to do later in life, they don't have an answer for it. It seemed like he was pretty well put together as to who he was and what his plan was. And as soon as this major change came up, it seemed like that all kind of crumbled and he no longer had an understanding.
I will say that I feel we saw a lot of Honoka in him in this episode, where in the test, he very well could have just not wrote anything, or he could have wrote it and not crossed it out, but he wrote it, then crossed it out. And he's even talking about that, like he let his ego get in the way. And I feel like that's a very Tomine thing. I mean, even kind of Alexander, too. Like, he had a big ego. So I guess,
Right.
both sides of them kind of had an ego on that one.
I can definitely see Honoka in that. Very kind of like headstrong, knowing what you want, kind of going for it, and then like obviously I think he'd been toying with this idea, and even though he was originally thinking I'm gonna throw this one, he still wrote it down and then crossed it out. But then
Yeah.
he at least recognized that in himself and saw that
Right.
that's not something that he liked in himself. And so that was at least a good moment of growth where he's seeing his own faults. Maybe in the fact that he's so conscious of his parents' faults now
Right.
that that's making him turn an eye inwards.
I do feel really bad for Issei. Like, this whole show as its entirety, we've got like Camille. She's doing heists. She's doing little wine heists. She's traveling to Italy. She's drinking all the wine. She's having a great time. Just like trying to connect with her dead dad. It's fine. Poor Issei here's dealing with this like existential crisis of like not knowing who his dad is. Not like was working with his real dad and who never brought up anything other than wine with him. They only talked about wine.
Yeah, it's pretty heartbreaking what he's going through. It's at least nice that he's found somebody on his side that he's with, and that's a pretty cute relationship to me.
It is a super cute relationship, and I really liked how they portrayed it in this episode, specifically with the colors. So I don't know if you noticed, you know, we saw that the innkeeper was talking about how she was wearing black mourning the death of her father. And from this time that we've seen Issei, he's been wearing all black. I think he's been wearing mostly all black, but in this episode, definitely all black. And, I wonder if it's partially like part of him mourning his father. But what I noticed when they first start kind of making eyes at each other, the journalist and Issei, the umbrellas, one was black, one was white, and she was wearing white, and he was wearing black. And so my first thought was yin and yang, or in Japanese, inyo. And if you look at them, she even makes a comment that he is a spoiled brat that knows how to cook. Like, she's surprised that he knows. So like they're two very different people, Issei is very reserved. He's quiet, he's rich, like he's well off, where she is a journalist, and most journalists are outspoken, outgoing, like they have opinion pieces and are getting into everyone's business. And I'm assuming that, she's not as well off as Issei. So she's like this loud journalist that's comes from not maybe poverty, but, rougher times than Issei. And Issei's this quiet, reserved, well-off person. So I thought it was a very cool, like, yin and yang between them. And I thought they showed that well with the white and black umbrellas.
And it's good timing for Issei, because I don't think that he's really had somebody to open up to. And I don't know if he's been comfortable enough to open up. I think he's been somebody that has kept things in his life. And so it's perfect timing with his whole world being kind of like turned upside down, of finally having somebody that he does feel comfortable opening up to. And interesting that he ends up trusting somebody who is a reporter and could totally exploit him. In fact, when she was like looking for the coffee cup and she found that box, I was thinking, like, this is the journalist side of her. She's going to find something juicy, and it's going to be an issue of like, how does she not run with the story? So I was worried that like she was going to be, even if it was accidental, that she was like mining information
Right.
about Issei, and that, and that would be something that I'm sure would close him right back up. And
Oh,
so I was
yeah.
kind of worried about that, and I was so happy when, it turned out that she was just curious, which makes sense as a reporter, but then
Right.
she used that to help him out rather than to exploit him.
I really had no idea where that was going.
I just think that the show just does a great job of keeping the intensity going, even when things are relatively mundane. If we look at the scenes in Italy, I thought it was really interesting that it started off with a gorgeous, typical shot that you would expect from Italy, and a song from, classic opera that is, kind of like an older Italian song. And so you would think it's going to be kind of like slow and stodgy. And then we hear the fast car, it tears into the frame, and the music flips the moment that it's in the frame to this high paced music. We keep that energy going with quick shots. In this, we don't have generally shots that are too long. So as they're hunting around for a white wine, which could be relatively boring, they've got a fast car, they've got interesting music, they've got short shots, and then like two sets of kind of interesting montages, which I think at appropriate times
Right.
kind of help that action kind of going. The show does this really well. We've seen, like, with opening the wine bottle. We've seen them turn the mundane into interesting things, and I thought that they did it well again in this episode. Not quite as well as like the wine heist episode, but still, they really know how to keep things kind of interesting. And so, even though for the most part crazy things don't really happen in this show, it's pretty simple drama stuff. I still have trouble not like looking out for those and being like, oh my God, what's going to happen?
Right.
Because they always kind of leave me with that feeling of something could happen, and something interesting is happening. So,
I did think it was funny that in the beginning of the episode, when they first get to Italy and there's that needle drop, the Figaro song,
yeah.
and it was like they drove the car like 3 times really quickly, like right after that. Like they went to the museum, they went to the place, they went to the winemakers. So they went to all these places, and every time it was like a banger needle drop in the car. Like every time they were going, it was like Lorenzo just bumping the music like loud as could be. And so I did think that was funny. Like I think it was like probably the first 5 to 10 minutes of the episode, we see 3 different spots where they're driving this fancy car and blasting this music. First, we heard the EDM version of Figaro when we first get there, and then that montage you were speaking of when they're doing the spit, which that was rough for me to get through because it's fine. Like when I'm watching them spit, it's fine. But like when we're focused above it and you just see like the splash, and it's like they're not spitting politely, like it's going all in. It's like just going everywhere, and they're playing the actual Figaro song. I thought that was very very well done.
It's funny to me because that shot was very stylized just so that they could have that kind of montage of spitting. I think generally if you have a spit bucket, a spittoon, you would keep your spit inside of that. But
Right.
then oftentimes, depending on where you are, some of these tastings were done in barns or outside of the place. And if that's the case, you oftentimes won't even have a spittoon. You can just
Spit
turn your
outside.
head
Right.
and just spit. So it definitely was stylized of like excessive like slopping over the sides.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
When they go to the first wine place, there's that long thing that he like pulls out of the barrel. Do you know what that's called?
It's a thief.
A thief.
It's literally called a wine thief.
That's called a wine thief?
It's literally called a wine thief. Yeah.
Oh. I saw that and I was like, I bet you Sterling knows what that is. So what do you know why they call it a wine thief?
No clue why it's called a wine thief, but for the children among us, that was inserted into the bunghole in order to get the wine. That is the technical term for that. Also, so when he did use the wine thief in order to get the wine, you'll notice that there was a gap in the barrel, and that gap in the barrel is called the angel share. And we understand this at this point, that the barrel, even though our eyes can't see it, we have microscopes. We understand that there are pores in this barrel, and so some of the wine is able to evaporate through those pores. But before microscopes were around, before that was a thing, and they didn't understand it, they literally thought that maybe angels were taking a portion of the wine rather than it evaporating. And so that gap is called the angel share. That was like the portion that the angels were taking. And it's something that you do have to manage because as that gap grows, you have more and more oxygen in contact with there. And so you generally want to top
Oh.
that off so that you don't have too much of that space.
Wow. That I had no idea. Had no idea. Okay, so there was when they're talking about the rival father guy,
Hmm.
they were talking about he did biodynamic wine. Do you
Yeah. So this is a really interesting one, and the reason that I think it's interesting is it's very similar to organic wine, in which you wouldn't use pesticides. You would want to use things like manure as fertilizer, and you would want to use certain natural treatments in order to deal with, critters that you don't want. The earth, in conjunction with kind of the universe, is all treated as a living thing. And so you're really kind of looking over like the whole health. It's interesting that things have to be done on certain days. There are root days, there are fruit days. So there are days that you can, harvest, days where you can, apply certain treatments, and that is determined by the positions of what's in the sky. There are certain, they referenced one of the kind of things that's done, which is like a cow horn with cow manure. You would fill the cow horn with cow
Oh,
manure, you bury it underground kind of over the year, like in the winter, you dig it up in springtime, and then you use this as like a type of fertilizer. It's interesting because it actually transforms from, cow manure being this kind of smelly thing to this thing that has this actually really pleasant, sweet aroma to it. And so this becomes kind of one of the treatments. Here's my kind of honest take on it is, so I'm an atheist. I err more towards kind of scientific things. So some of these practices, as far as like, based off of what's in the sky, we can only do this or this. I think to some extent that is silly, but at the same time, you I can't deny the results of this, because I think that it puts people in touch with their vineyard at a vine by vine level. And when you're dealing with your plants on a vine by vine level, rather than kind of dealing with it kind of like a large level with tractors and sprays, it puts you in tune with what's going on and forces you to have to deal with problems right away and know what's going on to be able to deal with those, and know what's going on to know when you need to harvest. It really puts you so closely in tune with everything that I think it helps you to make the right choices. As well as I do think that using things that are putting good things into the ground and not killing potential good bacteria is better than like pesticides, where you're indiscriminately killing not just the things you don't want, but also some of the good kind of biome
right.
in the earth that you do want. So I think it does have kind of better practices, and some of the best wines in the world are made that way, and they are damn good. So I might think some of it's silly, but in the end, I can't argue with the results.
So what you're basically saying is it's the astrology of wine keeping.
But it works.
But it works. But it works. That's the hippie woo woo
and
of
and
wine.
and there are entire areas where this has been, not enormous areas, but there are parts, like regions, that a lot of people in that region have adopted it. So it's become kind of the norm for that region. So it's not necessarily widespread, especially once you get to larger wineries that just have a ton of land. It's tough to kind of do practices like that. But actually, the in Napa, the one where I proposed to my wife, Quintessa, they do biodynamic winemaking, and it's really cool. Like, you can tell so much more, that they look at the earth and everything on it as kind of this living thing, because in Napa Valley you've got land is money and you want to grow as many vines as possible. And so there's not much other than the vines. It is beautiful there, but there's really not much there other than the vines, and then like the buildings to, make the wines in. And they're kind of tucked against the foothills, so they're more on like the rolling hills rather than like the flat plain. So they've got the beauty of the rolling hills, but they've got all of these gorgeous oak trees all around, and they didn't cut a single one down. So there's lots of land that could be used for vines, that is instead used, for these oak trees that were there, because all of that is part of this living thing. And so you can really kind of see the care for the land when you go to a place like that.
Gotcha. So it seems like it's also more like if it's like the bigger wineries, it's more like sterilized. Not sterilized, but like more hands off. Like of everything that goes into that, maybe all the different vineyards that or all the different vineyards you have and different grapes you have growing for all the different wines you're trying to make. You might not know what's going into each vine because you just have it a certain way and you just like set it and forget it. But like with this way, it's like you're getting your hands in there, you're knowing everything that is going into each vine, and that's cool. I like that.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. As someone who is going to Italy this year and has been to Italy before, did they do a good job representing wine in Italy?
I actually think they did a really good job of that. I think that they showed kind of some of the differences of some of these kind of smaller family operations, things that are generational, that are being passed from father to son, versus corporations that are being passed from CEO to CEO. I think that it really did kind of a good job of showing that, of showing what some of those operations look like, that maybe because they're smaller family operations, they don't have the greatest equipment in the world. When I was in Cinque Terre, as I was kind of going through some of the alleys, they were actually in the middle of harvest, and they'd brought out some of the equipment into the alley. And so something that's normally done with like a larger machine that's plugged in, that's electrical, they had a hand destemmer that had like a crank for turning it in order to kind of get that centrifugal force that has these slats like large enough for the stems but not the grapes to go through. And so they were doing that right there in the alley, and it was being done, by hand, probably by one of the family members. And so it did kind of remind me of that feel of being very personally involved, you know, having some of that family aspect. Not that they don't have large operations, they do certainly have some very large operations there, but they do have a lot of those kind of family passed on ones as well.
That's cool. I really like that. I like that a lot. With that, I think that about does it. And if you like this content, please hit that like and subscribe. And join us next time on The Road Goes Ever On and On. Thank you.
Thanks.